Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. We're just letting folks in and getting situated. So thank you for joining us, and we'll get rolling in maybe one more minute. We're just getting things organized. Sharing our fancy slide deck with you here. So we'll give it just one or minute or so just to let everyone join us. All right, I think we'll get rolling, and I'm sure others will join as they finish their pasta or other dinner items. But thank you on this fourth day of Media Literacy Week for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we have, I believe, a dynamic and exciting conversation coming up. My name is Tony Streit. I'm the board president of NAMLE, and really thrilled to be hosting this session tonight. Media Literacy Packs Power in Civics. This session is a joint session between NAMLE and the organization I work at, Education Development Center. And we put our heads together a number of weeks back and said, hey, we should do a session that's a conversation about the relationship between media literacy and civic education, in part because EDC and NAMLE have launched a project together that we're going to share a little information about. But we want this to be a conversation, a dialogue. So we've invited a number of guests to be with us and to think about this topic together. We're asking folks to be muted for the top of the session, but if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat and we'll draw them in as we go. But later we'll open up all the mics and you can turn on your camera and we'll continue the conversation with everyone. We are recording this, so know that it's being recorded and it will be shared on our NAMLE YouTube channel later on. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So to get us rolling, we're going to do introductions in a second. I'll introduce the panel to everybody. And then we're going to talk about this project I mentioned, this joint project between EDC and NAMLE and a bunch of others, because we think it's kind of a demonstration project of how media literacy and civics can be bound together. And then we have our panelists, and we're going to have a conversation again about these topics. And at the end, we'll have Q&A where you can all join us. So here's who we invited today. And I'll just say who's with us. And then I asked each of them to share just 1 minute about how their work currently involves either civics or media literacy or both. My colleague, Ray Davenport, is here. And she's been leading the curriculum development for us at Education Development Center. So she's going to share a little bit about how that curriculum is coming together and what it'll offer. And then to share some perspective, we've asked Scott Wilson to be with us. He's with Close Up and Teaching for Democracy Alliance and can talk about his work in civics. Stephanie Flores-Kulish, my fellow NAMLE board member, is with us. She's been an advisor on the service project. She's the director of curriculum instruction for social justice programming at Loyola University, Maryland, so knows a lot about this topic. And I'm so glad that she's with us. Wesley Hedgepeth is with us. He is a teacher of politics and history, but he's also the incoming NCSS president. That's the National Council for the Social Studies. they've also been a partner on Civics, and I'm for service rather. And I'm thrilled he could join us. And then there's me and all of you. So we're going to start by just giving everyone a chance to share a little. And maybe we'll start with you, Wesley. Can you share a minute about your current work and the intersection of civics and media literacy?
Sure. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Tony, for the invitation today. I'm thrilled to be here. As Tony said, I am a history and politics teacher in Richmond, Virginia, specifically world history and the AP government, both US and comparative courses. I also facilitate our Model UN team. And as a government teacher, both civics and media literacy are a part of my daily life, which we'll certainly be able to elaborate on later. I look forward to the conversation. I'm also a member of my school's civil dialogue task force, where we talk a lot about the skills that overlap in these two disciplines. I'm the past president of the Virginia Council for the Social Studies, and as Tony said, the current president-elect of the National Council for the Social Studies. For those of you who don't know us, we were founded in 1921, and we're the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. I've been on the board for 5 years now, and while I was vice president, I was pleased to lead the task force that developed a toolkit for diploma seals for civic readiness, supporting our members who sought to advocate for the civic diploma seal, which I'm also happy to talk about later on as well. Thanks again for having me.
Great to have you with us. Stephanie, can you tell a little of your story? I know, but others can hear.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks for inviting me also, Tony. I really appreciate it. So yes, I'm on the board for NAMLE. And in addition, I'm a teacher educator, a professor at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore, where I run the master's program, as Tony mentioned. And I also teach a course and have for many years on media literacy. And as he mentioned, there really is a natural intersection between media literacy and civics in a way that I think is linked tightly with social justice education. And so it's really kind of bringing a conversation for teachers to think about the importance of their work and how they can get students to engage in more critical understanding of the world around them. So it really takes under consideration a lot of Paulo Freire's ideas, but also Thomas Jefferson. So it's really kind of getting students to be aware of the culture that surrounds us, and that can be broadly defined in the ways that impacts students and how to get students to think deeply about the world around them.
Thanks, Stephanie. Wouldn't that be cool if Paulo and Thomas had met each other? Maybe someday, but Scott, could you share a little bit about your work?
Yeah, great. Of course. Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. And looking forward to our discussion tonight. So I'm representing both Close Up and the Teaching for Democracy Alliance. Our work at Close Up is focused on helping students from different backgrounds engage in dialogue and deliberation about pressing political and social issues. And so we often rely on common texts for these discussions and deliberations, but students, of course, are bringing in their own sources, their own ideas into these deliberations. And it can be really important to be able to help students also have discussions just about what constitutes reliable, useful, and persuasive sources. Additionally, in our professional development work with teachers, the subject of media literacy is pretty much ever present, but often it comes up in the form of questions such as, how can I tell if a student's source is credible? Or how do I make sure that students only bring in good sources? While that's a good position from the perspective of helping with a particular deliberation, from the perspective of building media literacy as a habit and a practice, it's already a little bit too late by the time such questions are coming up. And so that's something that we've certainly been thinking about a lot. I'm also representing the Teaching for Democracy Alliance, which is composed of 19 national nonpartisan civic education organizations, including NCSS and NAMLE. And we work together to promote, especially for teachers, but definitely we're focused a lot on administrators, helping them support good civic education, good teaching about elections and voting. And media literacy is, of course, a part of that.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be a part of it. So thank you, Scott. And then Ray, you can do a little intro and then we'll go right into the deck on service.
Thank you, Tony. I see what you did there because we're going to morph it into service, which is all things civics and media literacy. And so I have been working on the service initiative and project. And what we're doing is we have, because we're in our pilot phase right now, designed a curriculum that has an intersection of civics, media literacy, and some other components that I'm going to tell you about briefly. And so I feel like I have learned more about civics and media literacy in my adult life or the past year of my adult life than I knew before. And so really excited to share this initiative with you around the service curriculum. And so I'll just go right into it. So again, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, NAMLE, for the opportunity to talk about service. We have spent the last year crafting and designing a curriculum that we like to say has a special sauce to it, which I'm going to tell you about. I briefly said that it's merging, a lot of components together, civics, media literacy, STEM, career and workforce readiness all together. And it is an inquiry-based curriculum that we are giving teachers so that they can facilitate it with their students, which may be, we know sometimes that the inquiry-based curriculum is a bit of a shift for teachers and some of their teaching styles. So we're really excited about that. Really excited to get students engaged civically at the local level, the state level, and the national level, if we can. Next slide, Tony. So before I tell you what service is, the special sauce, all those goodies, let's talk about why service. What's the background for service? And so a couple of things that we know. We know that civics education is, consistently underfunded, and it fails to reach the underrepresented student populations or student populations in general. We know that based on research in this day and time, students seem to be civically unengaged. It's not something that seems to be top of mind for them. We also know that we want youth to participate in our democracy, right? We want them to be civically engaged, but we know that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation that may make them feel some kind of way about being civically engaged in their communities. And we also know that with folks retiring and new jobs in public service, the public service sector coming out, that there may be an employment gap that exists. And so we're looking for an opportunity to encourage young people to consider careers in public service and public safety. And so next slide, Tony. When we took all of those things into consideration, we got the service curriculum. And so what service does is it's blending the inquiry-based learning in civics, media literacy education, public service and safety careers, STEM, it's blending those all together. And it's packaging that curriculum and giving teachers the opportunity to facilitate, lessons about civics, but students are also learning about these other key components as well. So the project involves developing an entirely new curriculum. Like I said, we spent the last year designing it. We've intentionally weaved together civic learning, media literacy, the career and public safety pathways, so that high school students can be active citizens and thrive in the workforce. The inclusion of media literacy we know from our work is very important. And it's actually become a matter of national defense, as a national defense strategy lately. But we know that media literacy and democratic participation, they go hand in hand. And so we want to advance an approach to civics that is rooted in the community. It's going to empower our youth and let them know how they can be active citizens at the local, state, and national level. And while they're doing that, they get to explore real world work opportunities and those career pathways, like I said, in public service and in STEM as well. We're also wanting to get them to understand that public safety careers, we typically think are law enforcement officers, things like that. We're really wanting to expand their horizon about what a public service career is, and the fact that they can be in pretty much any career and still be of public service to others. Thank you. Next slide, Tony. So now we could not take this on by ourselves. As Tony has said, we have partnered with some outstanding organizations to help us support this endeavor. And so we are leading the project, Education Development Center, but we've partnered with Generation Citizen, who is amazing and has an amazing civics curriculum. We're working with TIES, who helps schools design and sustain a STEM ecosystems, amazing as well. We are working with NAMLE, and we don't know what we would do without them, to embed some of those guiding media principles into the curriculum. We're working with LAPSN and the National Career Academy Coalition to make sure that our career and workforce pathways are aligned. And we're even looking at seeing if students can receive some certifications depending on what that pathway looks like. And we've partnered with the National Council for Social Studies, super excited about that collaboration. They've been very instrumental in helping us recruit teachers. And we've also partnered with StoryCorps, who has phenomenal media resources that we have integrated into our service curriculum modules. Next slide, please. And so what does the service curriculum look like? Well, it is 5 modules. They are written around themes in civics. Module 1, we are asking students to explore their responsibility to serve others and what duty means to them. That module is titled Duty and Service. In module 2, we're asking them to explore how their voice can be used to persuade others. And we're paying special attention to how we are persuaded through media messaging. And so they get to do a really cool project with that at the end of module 2. In module 3, we're asking them to explore what is power, who holds that power, and how it can be used to influence others, with a specific focus on how it can be used to influence changes in policy. In module 4, they are exploring what does it mean to be loyal, what does it mean to dissent or disagree, but most importantly, how do you have a civil discussion when there is a disagreement? So that module is heavy with a civil discourse component in it. I see Wesley smiling, so Wesley, you know how I feel about that civil discourse. And our 5th and final module is titled Change and Impact. We are asking students to explore how they can initiate change within their communities and how small changes can impact things on a much larger scale. That module actually gives teachers the option if they should choose. We know a lot of states are coming up with civics requirements, but that module gives teachers the option to have their students' project roll into an actual capstone proposal. So we're super excited about that. Next slide, please, Tony. And so there are 5 modules. Each module has 15 lessons. They are designed to be 45 minutes each, and we are hoping that teachers can complete them over a 3-week period. We know teachers' plates are like super full, so we are offering some flexibility with the 3 weeks. We want them to do all 15 lessons, but if they have to do 7 lessons, take a couple days off and go to the next 7, and then do the last one 2 weeks after that, we're okay with that. We're just asking them to fully implement a whole module. Each module is designed with compelling questions, learning objectives. We're letting students know what focus skills they're going to be working on. We have integrated some profiles, stories from StoryCorps, project activities. It really, really is a very comprehensive program with the special sauce that we are hoping that it will have. Next slide, please. In addition to the modules, we've created a teacher toolkit for teachers so that they can use this to gain a deeper understanding of the components that I've been talking about for service. So before they start any module, we're asking them to look at the teaching service curriculum overview so that it can orient them to the things like the inquiry-based learning, creating a shared agreement within their class so that students feel safe discussing some of the issues that are presented throughout the curriculum. We have a component about engaging in civil discourse. What does that look like? How educators can set that up in their classroom. We have a whole module in there about facilitating media literacy skills. What should students be looking at when they're analyzing media? A component on career and workforce connections. And at the end, we are putting together some professional development resources that teachers can look at as well that help support them with the implementation of service. Next slide, please. So we have officially entered our service pilot experience. We had our first kickoff session on Tuesday. It was amazing. We're asking teachers that have committed to the experience to attend professional development workshops. They did one on Tuesday. They have another in January and another in May. We're asking them to fully implement at least one module with their students and provide feedback. And at the end of year 2, we are asking them to come together to showcase some of their student work. So we are really excited about this. We got a great response. It looked like teachers were willing to implement at least one. Some teachers want to implement more than one. So that's great feedback for us curriculum writers before we go to our set of final revisions next summer. Next slide, please, Tony. And so these are some of the states where we actually have teacher reviewers at. We've actually added some more states based on our attendance Tuesday. We now have teachers in California, Washington, Louisiana, and South Carolina. We are really looking for those states that are pushing that civic requirement though, because we think that this would be fantastic for them to implement in their classrooms with their students. And so if you know anyone, if you know any educators that would be interested in this, that it would be a good fit for, please send them our way. We would love to partner with them to get this curriculum in the hands of classrooms. And so next slide, Tony. If you are interested about anything service, I see that my wonderful colleague Kate has shared a flyer, a link in the chat for a flyer that gives teachers a QR code they can scan so they can get in contact with us. And my contact information is there. I am so excited. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about service and how the civics and the media literacy are those huge components that we want students to know. So thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Ray. Really appreciate it, and so glad you've joined us to be a part of the team and to work on this. It's been a fascinating project. So we wanted to start again kind of broadly, and then we'll look at this intersection. But Scott, you're both the efforts that you're involved in have really been advocating for greater access to civics. And I wanted you to start by sharing, like, what do you think is the state of civic education in the US right now? Are we getting somewhere?
That's a great question, a big broad question for sure. I think that many states are either redoubling their efforts or are rolling out interesting things like the seals that different states are doing, trying to find ways to spark innovative approaches at the district and school level. And so I'm encouraged by certainly what's going on in states like Illinois and California, as well as in states like Arizona and Florida, where they have passed some fairly strong, some bills that are at least putting a spotlight on civic education. For a fairly long time, civic education was just sort of neglected. Social studies as a whole was sort of neglected. And I feel as though some of those bills, the bill recently passed in Georgia, are at least putting a spotlight back on civics education. Whether that translates into great things going forward, I think people on this panel and teachers who are participating in the Media Literacy Week and other things like that will have a lot to say about how those efforts play out. But it does seem that at least they're getting some attention.
And Stephanie, you're seeing, young people coming through K-12, joining higher ed. How prepared are they? How honed are their civic skills and their media literacy skills? And do they see that there's this bond between them?
Yeah, also great question. And typically I teach teachers, but it just so happens that this fall I'm teaching freshmen in an introduction to education course. So these are young people that have perhaps made the decision to become teachers one day, elementary teachers specifically. And just this morning, actually, I did a different media literacy week presentation this morning that was a part of our class. And I asked them if they had ever heard of media literacy, and only one student had one minor experience in her school with media literacy education within, I think it was like a global studies course or something like that. Now, related to the civics piece, I'm not sure that I can quite tell that they have really a depth of knowledge in that regard. But I'm optimistic that young people, because of social media and the ways in which social media definitely has a fair amount of civically minded issues that go past it, they're more aware than, let's say, earlier demographics were, and I see that in my own children who are, of like later teenager age, and the way that they're aware of political issues and civic engagement is, to me, incredibly impressive. And so I think now is a wonderful time to launch a curriculum like this. So I'm excited for the impact that it'll have.
Thanks. Wesley, Scott was saying how, that social studies itself has had to kind of retrench over a number of years, to be fully invested in the educational space, and civics is like the step kid, and then media literacy is like the little junior. But like, we can't be going to schools and saying, well, now you must do this, this, and this. How have you seen effective ways of making sure that civics and media literacy get addressed without legislation and mandates and all of that sort of thing?
Yeah, Tony, that's a great question. I have to say that, yeah, social studies disciplines in general have been marginalized, and that does include civics. And I thought that something interesting Stephanie mentioned earlier about the knowledge that students are coming to her with. I wonder, my students in particular, I survey them, asking them how they feel about different skills that they have in the classroom. And I'm not so sure that they always are aware of what media literacy, of calling it that. They have the skill set. They know how to be discerning when it comes to sources, and they know that they need to look at the difference between media, where it comes opinion, and official news. And so those types of things, primary versus secondary sources, they know those types of skills, but I'm not so sure they always know that it's media literacy. And so I think that teachers, having that support from organizations like NAMLE, like NCSS, that can provide resources for teachers that will weave into the civics curriculum easily, I think is really hugely beneficial.
And Ray, I'm not sure that we mentioned it, and so I wanted to mention what I was sharing to the speakers before we started, that that we came to this project by way of Department of Defense, that they had called out a solicitation to do this project, and they particularly wanted media literacy embedded into the civic ed. And what do you, I'm giving you a softball question, but what do you think about, like, now that you've been in the process of developing curriculum, could you teach civics the way we wanted to without the media literacy? Like, why are they so integral?
So being so involved in the process at this point, like I don't know that I can even separate the two. After writing curriculum for the last year, I feel like, you know, given the state of our country and how polarized everything is, and the fact that like folks communicate, you know, using media, right? Like that's how we're getting all of this information. That's how students are getting the majority of their information, is from media and social media and things like that. And so I don't know how you would talk about issues that are important in your community, in your state, and in the nation, and ways for you to get involved without integrating media literacy. It's almost sounds absurd to me now. When we first started writing the curriculum, we were trying to make sure that we had it balanced, right? Like, do we have enough media literacy in the module? Do we need to add more? You know, which modules don't have enough? So I feel like it's really forced us to take a look at everything through that lens of media literacy.
And one of the great elements of the program has been having the student advisors. And have they helped us? Like, have you seen where they've injected a perspective that we didn't even think without, you know?
So the student advisors are funny, because, you know, we're writing curriculum and we're like, you know, should we put this issue in there? Like, no, we can't put that issue in there because like every state can't talk about this issue, right? And the student advisors are like, yeah, give us like all the controversial issues. You know, they just have a laundry list of them. And we're like, you know, we can't, but we have learned, I think something important that we learned was, you know, we can present the content in a way where students are able to sort of steer the discussion. So if a teacher is comfortable with their classroom having a discussion around something that may be controversial, they're able to do that. We're offering supports around having civil discourse, discussing controversial issues. We're asking teachers and students to actually bring in their own examples of media that illustrate different content that we're talking about. And so I think with all of those things in place, that you know, they'll still be able to tackle what they want to talk about, but we won't be losing sleep at night. Like, you know, do we need to edit that? Should we take it out? Is someone going to be offended? You know, do we find an article that was right in the middle, or a tweet or a text or something like that? So yeah.
Well, Wesley, I've been really impressed with how NCSS has walked that line, you know, that the things that are perceived as controversial or we can't touch this, and I've seen NCSS step out and say, well, this is part of the standards, you have to teach it, right? I mean, how have you seen both your organization and teachers in the field leaning into what's perceived as controversial content?
Right, just like teachers in the classroom, NCSS does not seek to be political. Unfortunately, there have been points when we have needed to stick our necks out. You know, the conversation earlier, Scott was talking about the standards that are being changed in states, and you know, of course, the standards will funnel down to exactly what's happening in the classroom. And so that's such a concern for us, that we are seeing a greater move from that bar trivia checklist to the skills-based standards using the C3 framework as an example, as one of those inspirations for it. But unfortunately, there are institutions that are presenting counters to that, and are moving back to suggesting that standards should kind of return back to when United States social studies classrooms presented a single narrative of US and Western history and glorified parts of history while minimizing the experiences, contributions, perspectives of Indigenous people, people of color, women, the LGBT community, the working class, et cetera, countless others. And so it's a really delicate balance, but we see it as defending good teaching and relying on best practices. And our organization has always supported standards and the reviews of standards that would follow that best practice. And the most recent research on the standards. And so yes, it is. It's a real challenge. We want students certainly to practice things like civil dialogue, and we want them to talk about difficult topics because there's this safe community in the classroom. We have this the classroom that the teacher has set up, that there's mutual respect, that there's norms that have been set, and we would be sending out, and I think it was Ray that mentioned earlier, uninformed citizens or unengaged citizens that don't have that skill, don't have that practice. And so the advocacy for the skills-based versus the content lists is just that. It's for allowing our teachers, our practitioners who know their students best, who know their communities best, to be able to practice those skills that students can then use in civic engagement, which one of those skills, of course, is intrinsically media literacy.
Yeah, Scott, in working with young people, how do you see them navigating this space now? Are they feeling threatened, or are they, like Ray was saying, like, bring it on?
I agree with Ray. I think they're very confident. Not always accurately confident, but often fairly confident that they're able to discern good sources from bad sources. And something that I know I didn't do when I was 15 is I didn't have a person who I didn't know personally, who I sort of trusted to tell me about the world. But through things like TikTok, that is much more prominent now, that high school freshmen and sophomores will have ideas shaped about the world by somebody who they follow, who talks about a lot of things that happens to include politics, social questions, things that we would consider sort of the domain of civic education. But they also talk about fashion, or they talk about sports, or they talk about other things. And so students don't always see that as media or a news source, because when they hear the phrase news source, they think of the New York Times, and they think of PBS, and they may even think like, oh, I don't read the news, or I don't watch the news. But they are engaging with information from a variety of sources, a lot of which are hard to, as a teacher, it's hard to immediately know what to make of any source that you haven't heard of. And you're more likely to encounter students now bringing up sources that, as a teacher, you're unfamiliar with than probably was the case even 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago.
Stephanie, in your work with teachers, like there's been a lot of focus on the threats to social studies and civics, but some people perceive media literacy as threatening too. And do you see that teachers are embracing media literacy as something essential to their practice, or does that take a certain amount of push?
I would have said it took push a while back, but I feel increasingly that teachers are embracing, at least the teachers that come our way. And that's, teachers that are attracted to the kind of program that I run, which has social justice in its name. And we're situated in the state of Maryland. And so it's a state that I think is more, open and less restrictive as some of these other states are. And so I find that the teachers who are learning about elements of media literacy are completely embracing it. And I think about like some of what Scott was saying and how these new sources are coming, in a tidal wave and in so many ways in new media and in TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that. And so it's going back to the key questions that media literacy provides, that teachers can kind of take that out of their back pocket and use that for any sources. And there's one kind of unit that I've done with my students all through the years, which really is relevant in this particular case. And that is, I used to kind of think, what do we do the day after some major situation happens? Like I started teaching shortly after 9/11 to teachers, and it was a really big deal at that time that a lot of schools weren't allowed to talk about it right after it happened. And I was just so struck by that. And I ended up leaning into media literacy, saying, well, one, we have to talk about it. And here's a way to talk about it, is by asking these critical questions about this topic. Next, it was, another major school shooting, or the Hurricane Katrina. And so through the years, it's been like these pivotal events. Now, I think it's like anything on a daily basis, like Scott brought up in terms of TikTok. And if you're not familiar with the source, ask critical questions of this source and piece of media, and teachers find that really handy, and basically that they can kind of take advantage of these ongoing teachable moments that will arise when students bring up these new topics in the classroom or new perspectives.
Well, Stephanie, you brought up in your program that social justice is pivotal, and so this is kind of a question that I'm asking to all of you, and then we can have our attendees join in. But when you think about media literacy and you think about civics, it's hard not to also think about equity and social justice. And again, we've said like, oh, some people are threatened by these topics, but how do media literacy and civics help us understand the history of injustice in our country, or the need for equity? How do we make that more present and not threatening to people? Does anyone have a perspective on that?
Tony, if I may, the NCSS recently published a position statement back in June regarding media literacy that really helped to define the discipline, and actually offers key questions when asking about analyzing media messages. And one of the questions that's really important that hits on equity is who is benefiting from this message economically and politically. And I don't think that students always consider that. The traditional method of sourcing and who was the author, who was the intended audience, those traditional questions don't always get to that equity issue of who's really benefiting and who's not, who's left out in that message.
That's great. And you brought that up too, that's often at the core of the content of history instruction, is whose story is it? Who values it? Anyone else have something to share about this aspect of equity?
Echoing Wesley's point. Oh, sorry. It's really hard to this is something like working with pre-service secondary social studies teachers and talking about media literacy. It's hard to keep consistently coming back to that question of what perspectives, what voices are missing from any one story or from stories as a whole presented by this nebulous concept of the mainstream media. But that can be a really important thing to do. And that includes things like thinking about the diversity of the editorial boards and the reporting staff of newspapers and television outlets. It also includes things like looking at what they have hired for and what they have not hired for. That they stopped having labor correspondents in the 80s at most every national newspaper. So the New York Times and Washington Post were among the last to get rid of having, or the last to stop having labor and union correspondents. And now it's kind of being left to non-mainstream journalists to cover what's going on at Amazon and at Starbucks. It's very hard to find good reporting on what's happening in the labor movements across the country, because if it's not happening in New York City or in Washington, D.C., it's being missed by those big outlets that have their headquarters there or in LA. And so that question of what's missing is vital to ask, but it's also exhausting to find what's missing. It's very hard as a teacher to have to go and find what is missing and to supplement the mainstream perspectives with maybe more critical perspectives.
Yeah, but it's always there, right? The who didn't we include or whose perspective. One of the things that's fascinating about our work at EDC is that many of our projects are national in scope. And so we will, in authoring something, go, well, how will people read this in Oklahoma? Or how will people read this in the territories or in tribal lands? You know, like there's always somebody that you haven't considered. Ray, you were going to share something.
Yes, Wesley and Scott, to echo both of them, a word that you both use that I feel like is very central to the service project that we're working on at EDC is the audience, right? Like, who is our audience? Are we building in opportunities for students to analyze historical examples and media messages where they can say, okay, you know, who is the audience here? Who is this intended for? In one of the modules, they actually have to craft a position statement. And so to prepare them for that, we're asking them to ask themselves, Wesley, that pretty much that list of questions that you said, so that they're able to, you know, make sure that when they share their position statement or share a perspective, that they are being mindful of their audience. And we're also really celebrating all the different perspectives that students bring, right? Because that's where that equity piece comes in. We're asking them to examine themselves first. Like, the first lesson of every module is take a look at yourself. You know, what's your duty? You know, how do you use your voice? How have you made change? And so really getting them to understand that everyone's not going to come from the same space or educational landscape or community. And so my answer might not be the same as Wesley's answer, but it's still as important as Wesley's answer. And so I think that audience is just so key to equity, civics, all of it.
I'll just jump on board with that also to just extend it to say, you know, we're talking a lot about these kind of concepts and cerebral kinds of elements, but ultimately I oftentimes come back to saying that it's about the students, right? We teach content, but we're really teaching students. And what are we teaching students for? Students, there are our future, and that sounds really corny in one sense, but on the other hand, it's absolutely true. And it's a humanistic endeavor, right? And so, you know, I'm situated in a Jesuit institution that uses those kinds of values to think about, you know, how we can live peaceably with each other and respectfully. And that sometimes isn't always easy, but to kind of come back to centering it on issues of humanity and love. And that really makes it hard to argue against if you sort of come at it from that perspective, to think that we need to think about those who are most marginalized, to uplift them at all times, and we'll live in a better society peacefully.
Thank you, Stephanie. I could say a lot about that, but I actually want to let other participants join in at this point. So Kayla, if you could unpin us and let any of the attendees join, you're welcome to turn on your cameras, and you can use the reactions to raise your hand and raise a question. But I did see something in the chat that I thought was really interesting. And Jelena, you had mentioned something about a festival in Serbia. Can you share a little bit more about it?
Thank you, Tony. It's 222 in Nairobi, Kenya. And I was one of the leaders of, let's say, something that later evolved in resistance movement, famous resistance movement with a fist, but I was working in civil society sector. As part of donations coming from foreign governments, as well as fundraising coming from stakeholders in former Yugoslavia, a festival for students started in 2000. However, it evolved into a commercial festival. That festival had its ups and downs because the people who started the festival had a lot of fights. In that sense, I was listening to Regan, and did I say right? About the project that she's and her team that they are actually developing or piloting at the moment. In that sense, it's very important that at the very beginning, people who contribute as volunteers, interns, that they're recognized, because they would like to get some appreciation. Because in that sense, you are avoiding future conflicts, and who did first, who invented the sign, who was the one who brought the first performer, like, I don't know, Rolling Stones, etc., to Serbia. So I did that for my UNESCO studies, because I have MA in cultural policy and cultural management. And I can share that document because it can show you steps and review where the setbacks were, and where actually something that it's a brand that promotes my region actually could become very controversial.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that'd be wonderful if you could share.
Amazing,
And did you say that you're joining us from Nairobi?
Yes, I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I was in Middle East.
Well, thank you
Africa.
so much for that. But this is what I found compelling, and I'm kind of sharing this to our panel, that, and I think, Ray, we may be at fault in doing this, that I suspect that every context of civics that we've presented has been from a US perspective, which kind of makes sense given our funder, but you know, that we aren't the sole democracy in the country, and I mean in the nation, in the planet, and I wonder whether there's opportunities in civics ed or even in media literacy to look outside of our, you know, national perspective and actually come back and bring wisdom back. And like, Wesley, do you see that happening in US history classrooms?
That's a good question, Tony. I was immediately thinking that back tying to our equity question and media literacy, that that students need to see themselves not only in the history but also in the documents that they're working with, that in the media that they're working with. They need to see themselves in the actors who are producing that that type of media. I think that's another a tie that we could tie to U.S. history classrooms or U.S. government classrooms, and bringing in global actors that could certainly look like and share commonalities with some of our students, and I think that would increase buy-in for our students. So I think that certainly while the U.S. history class is focused on the U.S., I think when you're looking at the U.S. involvement in Korea, for an example, when you're teaching students of Korean descent, it would be hugely helpful to tie in not just current events, but also could we bring in authors that are of Korean descent, and could we analyze their writing and seek to understand their message, but then also use that same critical eye of the media literacy questions that I was mentioning earlier, such as who the author is, what the intent is, and then of course who is missing and who benefits from that message.
Can I just add one thing? I just recently did assessment on civic education and engagement and political participation in Jordan. It's a confidential document because it's commissioned by the USAID. However, keep it on the radar because it will bits and parts will be published, because the team was international, 2 local researchers from Jordan, myself from Serbia, former Yugoslavia, based in Kenya, like 10 years here, and US professional expert in this field. So it speaks a lot about voting, different systems, how European perspectives or Korean perspective or Chinese perspective in voting system is found its nest, for instance, in Kingdom of Jordan, and how sometimes some areas feel neglected. And one of the findings I can share ahead is that, for instance, in many cases, we've learned that mostly men and boy populations, young men, felt neglected, which is totally contradictory to everything what we're doing.
Interesting. Well,
It's
thank
very
you for that, and please do share when it comes out.
Yes, and
Stephanie,
I will share.
were you going to?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about a quick course that I piloted last year and taught a couple of times to teachers that did involve kind of global ideas, and it was centered on climate change. And so I think, there's, a lot of movement in media literacy and climate change with like Antonio Lopez's work that I think does kind of get a more global conversation happening, but as well, even talking about issues like borders, immigration, nationalism, patriotism, those sorts of topics, I think, are really crucial to have in a global kind of contextual conversation. And in the class that I taught, we actually had teachers that were from other countries that joined us on Saturday discussions with my students, and my students found it to be so eye-opening to hear from them about their perspectives, even on issues of topics like race and racism within their societies. But as well, we were really fortunate. We had a couple of teachers from the Ukraine that were in exile that joined us in our conversations. And it was just really powerful to have these kinds of conversations. And the class, just to kind of bring it back a little bit to the medias, we started out in the class by talking about the film Don't Look Up. And so we looked at it in a critical way that did kind of show the folly that a lot of us have here and the ways that we're kind of drawn in by the media foolishly.
That's a great example, and not just particular to any country, but that we're all, grappling with what we're doing to our planet. So thanks for sharing that. We are at time, and I want to thank our panelists. I loved this conversation. It was fascinating, and I could tell we could go on for another hour, but we promised to do 60 minutes. And thank you so much. Again, we're archiving this conversation, and we'll share it, and we'll keep everybody updated on the status of service. We're still in the pilot phase. but the intent is to make it freely available and to get it taught anywhere that there's interest. So if you are interested in the project, there's links in the chat, and Ray or I or anyone at NAMLE can help with that. So thank you, Stephanie, Wesley, Scott, Ray. Also thanks to the NAMLE team, Meg, Carson, Kayla, for facilitating. We've really appreciated this. And everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow on the last day of Media Literacy Week. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.